Good morning. Today I'm talking about, of course, Van Halen.
Wow, Van Halen, who else?
I want to rank all 12 studio albums from worst to best. But before I do, please go ahead, like the video, click subscribe. That way you'll get keyed into future videos just like this one.
Look at all the people here tonight!
Okay, full disclosure, I am a Dave guy. However, I love the Sammy years. I love a lot of the Sammy albums, a lot of the Sammy songs. The two of them, I don't want to get into the whole comparison of the two, because comparing the two is like comparing Tom and Jerry. You know, one's tried and true, very reliable, and the other one is a ridiculous riot. So, in all fairness, let's not get too much into that. You should know ahead of time going into this, I'm going to lean towards some Dave albums, especially when we get to the top of this list. Now, I just recently did a video trying to figure out, and by using methodical math, what is my favorite, I think it was a Spider-Man and Batman Rogues gallery. So I thought maybe I could apply the exact same thing to this.
I forgot the fucking word!
Without giving too much away, here's the spreadsheet I used to figure out the ranking of the album order. And as you can see, there's multiple tracks on each album. Some albums had more tracks than others. I ranked each track from 1 to 5 and then gave it an average.
I've seen a lot of videos where they rank every one of the Van Halen studio albums, and when they get to the top of the list, I'm like, what, are you kidding me? That's insane. But to be fair, when I go through them and I try to figure out like which one is my favorite, I had no idea. So I was going to go through this method to figure that out. Now, if you asked me when I was a kid, I would have said Van Halen 1 or maybe Fair Warning, maybe, 1984 during a hot minute. And then later on in my adult life, I maybe would have said Women and Children first. So the result is a surprise. And it made me really embrace that album and go, okay, yeah, I get it. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm looking forward to you finding out what that is too. You can also go ahead and apply this same method to figure out what's your favorite album of the Van Halen albums. Or you could do it with some other album, or you could even do it with movies, or you could do it with, whatever. Literature if you want. Let's get started. Now, every time you do one of these worst to best videos, there's always the worst at the front of it. And I hate having to do this at the beginning and being all negative. But this first album, it's the worst. Let's talk about it for a minute.
Van Halen 3. It's the worst album. I didn't buy it when it came out. I remember listening to a few of the tracks and just not giving a shit whatsoever. I remember, Lethal Weapon 5 had on its soundtrack, Fire in the Hole. So that was the only, real recognizable song. I don't own this album, so I had to go and listen to the tracks on YouTube or something like that. And I went through each track. I think this is the only Van Halen album that got 1 star for several tracks. Never mind just one track. So, its best songs on it are a 3. It belongs at the bottom. It's really the only album on this entire list that is just terrible. So it had an average song rating of 1.8. That was being generous. It had 0 5s, and bang for the buck, it was still the worst out of all of them. Even having 12 tracks, it only got a total score of 21. There you have it. Van Halen 3 is last place. Number 11 on my list is Balance. Now, Balance has maybe 1 4, 1 5, and that's the instrumental track gets a 5. It was the worst Sammy Hagar album. They really had gone downhill by that point. Just compared to other bands and other albums, it's an okay album. It's not that bad. It's just Balance had an average score rating of 2.9. There was only 1 5 on it. And that was the instrumental track, so boo-hoo for Sammy. It had a total score rating of 29 points, so it's still, pretty low. It's Sammy's worst. Number 10 on the list, and I was surprised this showed up as low as it did, but hey, all these are great albums, so, one of them's got to be at the bottom of the list here, and that's OU812. OU812, I remember growing up, I loved this album. It's great. It's got 2 5s on it, so, compared to most albums for any band, it's a decent album. It has 4 4s on it, so, how can you complain? And with that said alone, that just tells you that if this is the 10th best album and it's got 4 4s and 2 5s on it, Van Halen's an awesome band. An awesome band. So credit is due here. I do remember this was the first concert I ever went to as a kid. I went to the OU812 Van Halen concert. So you'd think with that said, it would be higher up on my list, but it's just not after figuring out, the value of these tracks. OU812 had a song average of 3.5 and it had 2 5s on it. It had an overall score of 35 points. Number 9 on my list, and this doesn't surprise me, but this is going to be the first David Lee Roth album to show up. So this is ranked the worst David Lee Roth album on the list thus far, and that's Diver Down. Diver Down had an average rating of 3.5, just like OU812. However, I put Diver Down above OU812, and that's because it has 3 5s on it. It had a total overall score of 35 points. Diver Down, and bear in mind, Diver Down, this is a very controversial album within the band for themselves because there was a lot of infighting going on during this. This was kind of Dave's album because Dave got to do a lot of the things he wanted to do. It was in line with the studio where Warner Brothers did want them to pump out an album because there was interest, because they had done a couple of songs that were cover songs, one being Pretty Woman. They produced another one, Dancing in the Streets, and they needed to produce an album really quickly. Dave was in favor of doing cover songs. Eddie was not. It caused a lot of problems. This is what led to the culmination of 5150 Studio, where Eddie had all the control going forward. And in order to pump out all of these songs that they needed to put together for an album, they did a lot of cover songs, and that's why it's so low on my list. Now, it is tied with OU812 for total average song score with a 3.5. However, I put Diver Down above this because Diver Down had 3 5s and OU812 only had 2. It also has a total bang for the buck value total score of 39 points versus 35 with OU812. All right, number 8 on my list is another David Lee Roth album. This is Different Kind of Truth. This is the last studio album Van Halen ever recorded. The reason this one does go above Diver Down is because there are some old school Van Halen songs that they never recorded in a studio album and put out on, a studio album. Yet they dug these kind of out of the basement and polished them off and put them together. And there's a handful that are really good tunes. There's some fun songs on this album too. Tattoo. Tattoo only gets a 4 for me, but I thought it was a lot of fun. It also grew on me too. Like it was one of those ones when I first heard it and I was like, what? I don't know. But then they have a couple of really great tunes like You and Your Blues. I give Dave some credit on that one. Some of the lyrics on that are fantastic. It's got a great little melody to it. She's the Woman is one of those old school classic songs that they had dug out of the basement. Same with Big River and Blood and Fire, all of which are just great songs. I think I gave 5s for most of those. Now this one has an overall average song score just above Diver Down and OU812 with 3.54, but it has 4 5s on it. It has a total bang for the buck score of 46 points, and that's just because this is the album that has the most tracks on it. So naturally that one got a higher score there, but that doesn't allow me to put it higher up on the list. The average score is what got it there. Number 7 on the list is For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. Yeah, I was a kid I think I was in high school at the time. It was a lot of fun. I'm like, hey, they named an album after the word fuck. How cool! Not as cool now if you look back on it, but that's okay. This was when the album was released. This is where I saw the most concerts. I went to 3 concerts. I think I saw 2 at the Worcester Centrum, and then I forgot what it was called. But there was a theater down in Rhode Island, and I went and saw that one as well. And they put on a great show. I mean, this was back in the day when you went to see a band play. They performed all of the tracks, or almost all the tracks, for their latest album, and their tour was always to promote that album. So this was one of the last times you kind of got to see that. Now, this one only had 3 5s on it, just barely beats out Different Kind of Truth, but it did have an average score of 3.6. And that's because it had a lot of decent songs on it. There's plenty of 3s. I think there was only 1, 2, but it had 3 5s, and it had a total bang for the buck of 41. So you could, you're splitting hairs here, but you could put Different Kind of Truth above it, but they're so close, and I just was going with the average song score, so this one beats out Different Kind of Truth. So For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge is at number 7. Number 6, this one surprised me because this is an album that was my favorite album for many, many years, and now that I methodically go through and look at the value of this. And by the way, this has 5 5s on it. So this should be higher with that said, but it had an average score, and that's because there's a couple of duds on it, but it had an average score of 4.14, and that is Women and Children First. I love this album. So it's disappointing that it shows up 6th based on this method, and it has 5 5s on it. Such a great album. This is actually a little fun fact. This is the first synthesizer song to show up on any Van Halen album. This is the 3rd studio album. And The Cradle Will Rock is actually like the opening part of that song is a Wurlitzer electric piano, played by Eddie, of course. So that sound technically is their first ever synthesizer. It just, it doesn't really sound quite like a synthesizer. Most people think it's a guitar. It's not. Now, if I were to go through and look at some of the songs on here, Everybody Wants Some, Romeo Delight, Take Your Whiskey Home, In a Simple Rhyme. These are fucking awesome songs. I mean, these are really great songs. I hear any one of these on the radio. Not only do I turn up the radio, but if I was using my iPod, I would go back and listen to the track again. They're just so awesome. One of the things that kind of hurts this, though, is, it's got Fools on it. It's got Lost Control, Tora Tora. Those are, whatever. I mean, Tora Tora is not really a full-fledged song. It's more of just an instrumental, but still. And then Could This Be Magic? That's a fun track, but it's nothing special. This had an average of 4.14 total song score average, but it had 5 5s. It did have a total bang for the buck, and this is one of the lower. I think this is the worst, aside from Balance and Van Halen 3. A total score of 34, but that's just because there's only 9 tracks on it, and one of them doesn't even count. Track 5, I don't even count that, as anything. Okay, now we're getting into the nitty gritty. These are like the, across the board. If you're talking about any bands, these are phenomenal albums. Surprisingly, number 5 is their first studio album, Van Halen. This has 5 5s on it, just like Women and Children First. It has 4 4s. It has a total average score of 4.2. Bang for the buck, it's got 47 as a total score. This is one of those albums that just, you put this on for somebody that's never heard Van Halen and they're like, who the fuck are these guys? Unbelievable. Holy shit. So many people talk about this. If you were a kid at this time or in high school, when this album came out, it changed your life. Holy crap when this album came out. This is one of those rare albums, too, where you put it in and it's just, track after track after track is solid. I've got 2 3s on here, which is the 2 last songs. Ice Cream Man I was never really a huge fan of, so to be fair, I had to give it a 3 because if I do hear Ice Cream Man, I'm like, I like it. It's it's a good song. It's just, I got to be fair. I'm giving it a 3. On Fire is another one. I gave On Fire a 3, and not because I dislike it. It's just, comparably speaking, it's just an average Van Halen song. The rest are just iconic. So Running with the Devil, Eruption, I'm trying not to count some of the little instrumentals, but when they're really, really good and they had such a great impact, I do count them and they do get a score, and Eruption gets a 5. You Really Got Me. I was never a huge fan of that, so that's one that kind of brought this album down a little bit. But Ain't Talking About Love is probably one of the top 5 to 10 greatest Van Halen songs. I'm the One, I love I'm the One. Jamie's Crying, fantastic. Atomic Punk, oh. Feel Your Love Tonight, I love it. Little Dreamers is a great song, So this is a very, very solid album. Not to mention, I will point this out. This might be the best album cover. That's tough to say. They actually have some decent album covers. I like 1984's. I like Women and Children Firsts. So, some are lesser, but those are the 3 big ones that I do really love. Number 4 on this list is 1984. 1984 is really what introduced most of the music listening world to Van Halen. I mean, they kind of had hit the scene with the first album, but they were still kind of like a cult classic type of band. And then Diver Down's tour really made them explode. And then this was the one where it was like, okay. And honestly, in all fairness, this should have been, it's one of the greatest albums of all time, but it should have been the album that went number 1, but it went against the album that is the greatest number 1 album of all times in Michael Jackson's Thriller. So it just couldn't compete. And it's unbelievable that it's number 2 and went number 2 against it for so long. So it's kind of unfair that happened. This should have been a number 1 album, but it wasn't.
The truth is, Wild Stallions will never be a super band until we have Eddie Van Halen on guitar.
Yes, Bill, but I do not believe we will get Eddie Van Halen until we have a triumphant video.
Ted, it's pointless to have a triumphant video before we even have decent instruments.
Well, how can we have decent instruments when we don't really even know how to play?
That is why we need Eddie Van Halen.
And that is why we need a triumphant video.
Excellent!
Jump was their first number 1 big single that the band ever had to that point. And it's funny because Dave and Eddie had always fought over not having too many synthesized songs or even any on their albums. And Eddie just fought it tooth and nail and got this one on there. And and Dave admits it later on. Dave uses this in all their tours, even when he's solo, as the encore, the big song. It's probably one that he acknowledges as his most recognizable song. So Dave does embrace the fact that he may have been wrong on that fact. It also has, 4 5s on it, and it has a total bang for the buck of 47 as its total score if you add them all up. Which is funny because it doesn't have a lot of tracks on it. It only has 9 tracks, and one of which I don't even count, and that's the intro 1984, which leads into Jump. And I had to give Jump a 5. I had to give Panama a 5. Panama is probably one of the most iconic songs. Van Halen's so associated with that song. But there's 2 other songs that are like, I want to say they probably are in my top 5. Hot for Teacher. If you schematically break that down, that is one of the most brilliantly written songs, both drums and guitar. If you listen to the drums that crescend for that song and get you pumped and pumped and pumped. Oh, and by the way, I used this song at my wedding. This is what introduced the wedding party because it has that, leading up. So exciting. Everyone got pumped for it too, leading up to it. Hot for Teacher is and by the way, Dave, he's such a tongue-in-cheek vaudeville type showman. If you listen to the lyrics of this song, this is the epitome of David Lee Roth and the Van Halen years with David Lee Roth. And especially the video. If you've seen the video with the Waldo character.
Oh, Mom, I'm not like
and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Phil Harbin played the voice of Waldo in the Hot for Teacher video.
I'm nervous and my socks are too loose.
Even like the original song recording has some fun little things that David says, like, I don't feel tardy, or the I brought my pencil, all that kind of fun stuff. So like, it is one of the most fun songs that I think Van Halen ever produced. Not to mention the guitar solo in it, hands down, is one of the most unbeatable guitar solos you'll ever hear. It's such a fantastic song. I can't dissect that song any more than I already have. And then I'm going to get to, I think it's my second or third favorite Van Halen song altogether, and that's I'll Wait. It's one of their second big, like really synthesized songs. The main chorus melody was not written by David Lee Roth. It was written by Michael McDonald of the Doobie Brothers. And what a great little marriage of styles that they have, where, Doobie Brothers always wrote great little melodies. And Van Halen, who is a hardcore rock band at their heart, and they just throw that on top of it. And Dave embraced this and was such a really great song that he was able to, have a melody and a chorus too. I think it's either my second or third favorite song, right there with DOA. Number 3 on my list, and this is an album that was my favorite multiple times as a kid or as a young adult, going back and forth. And that's because, I'll get into a couple of the specific tracks, but Fair Warning, which is their darkest album, it surprisingly didn't do that well when it came out, which led to some of the controversy with Diver Down, and Eddie didn't have some of the choices that he wanted to do to make that album. But this has my favorite song, which is Dirty Movies. And then it has, and I'll differentiate the two here, it has their best song. And I say, like, one is my favorite, one is the best. Mean Street is probably the best written Van Halen song. And if you really break it down, it is a just classic anthem song that just is unbeatable. Opening guitar solo, so fantastic. The attitude that Dave has through this song, and Dave's attitude through this whole album is really, really like gritty and tough and badass and kind of got some snark to it. But this song, it's unbeatable. I would put Mean Street probably in the top 5 greatest songs ever written. Now, it's not my favorite, but it's in the top 5 Van Halens for me. But like Dirty Movies is just kind of like my dirty little secret, my guilty pleasure, as it were, because it's the lyrics in it. Well, and first of all, if you compare Dirty Movies to Mean Street, they both have 2 of the greatest guitar openings ever. Mean Street might have a better guitar solo in it than Dirty Movies, but Dirty Movies has one hell of a great guitar solo within it. Dave's lyrics in this are some of the most quintessential Van Halen lyrics. Daddy's little sweetie after some damn rainbow. Got the big deal in the back of a limo. It's the best. It is the best. Track 8, Sunday Afternoon in the Park, is an instrumental. It's just kind of a dud. I don't even count it. And then One Foot Out the Door, that's actually kind of what brought this album down a little bit. Its average is a 4.38 for the song average, but it's got 4 5s on it. It has a total bang for the buck 35, which is kind of low, but that's because there's really only 9 tracks. One of them doesn't count. So you got 8 tracks that are just, affecting this. And that last track gets a 3. But Unchained, So This Is Love. Those are such great. They got 5s, by the way. Those are such great songs. And one thing to say, what made Van Halen, you cannot argue it. It's Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen is maybe one of the greatest guitarists ever. Alex Van Halen is one of the most underrated drummers of all times. He's got such fantastic rhythm as a drummer. Not to mention, that's one thing Eddie too. Like Eddie has really great rhythm, and people take that for granted. They just think he's kind of wiry and flinging sound all over the place. He really has an unmistakable rhythm to him that is really tough to beat. Someone that comes to mind is actually Malcolm Young of AC/DC. He's one of the best rhythm guitarists. Eddie has what would be like Randy Rhoads / Angus Young melded in together with Malcolm Young's rhythm that is unmistakable and makes him one of the greatest musicians of all times, not just to mention guitarists. Okay, so now we're in our top 2, and you probably guessed one of these as being number 2 knowing that I'm a big Dave guy. So number 2 probably isn't the Dave one. And that's 5150. I was really surprised to see that this showed up as number 2. However, it's just such a great, great album. And this also has, I think, what's maybe my third or fourth favorite song of all times, which is 5150. 5150 is one of the best songs. Like it's in my top 20 greatest songs ever written. It has top 2 or 3 greatest Van Halen opening guitar solos, not to mention guitar solos in it. You see them in concert, and that song just, like, you just jump out of your seat and get so excited for. And this one has 7 5s on it. So bang for the buck, this got a 42 total score. It has an average song score of 4.63. It was tough. I remember when Dave left the band, they've got a new singer, and like Sammy Hagar wasn't that big of a solo guy. I mean, he was a big solo band guy, but thinking from the terms of Van Halen, you're like, oh, yeah, he's going to be okay. Let's hear what he's got. It's going to be different. People had low expectations of it. And when it came out, holy smokes. And I think in all fairness, I'm a huge David Lee Roth, Eat 'Em and Smile guy. The comparison of 5150 and Eat 'Em and Smile, 5150 might have kind of won that battle, although, I have some favoritism towards Eat 'Em and Smile. But it belongs number 2, and I have to be fair. As much as I like Dave better than Sammy, there you have it. 5150 beats out all of those other, beats out Fair Warning, 1984, even the first Van Halen. So, and I'm just doing this based on the math of it, so I am surprised. Do I have the favoritism towards it that beats out the other ones? Maybe not, but math wins. Math wins. Now, I do kind of want to point out one of the big controversial differences between David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar. Sure, Sammy's probably the better singer. I don't think that's a huge argument. I mean, I've heard David Lee Roth in interviews, and he's not comparing himself to Sammy. He's a pretty modest guy. He's like, yeah, I'm not the best singer, but what makes Dave great is his vaudeville showmanship that he brings to it, his tongue-in-cheek flavor to it, and then his attitude. I want to say that attitude-wise, there's really only one person that compares to David Lee Roth in that category, and that would be Steven Tyler of Aerosmith in the rock vein. I mean, sure, if you want to count like Louis Armstrong and Frank Sinatra and all those guys all had attitude, and that's what made them great. And that's part of what makes Dave great. But Dave brings so much fun showmanship to it that it's difficult to compare. And it really is what makes the original Van Halen so much different than the Van Halen with Sammy Hagar. Now, Sammy Hagar, and this is something that always disappointed me. Sammy Hagar is very vocal about his attitude towards Dave. I kind of wish he wouldn't do that so much, because when you hear Dave talk, Dave is extremely diplomatic about it. Everything's kind of like a WWF kind of like flavor to it, and he adds these fun comments. He's like,
"You said this about me, and then I said no. You said it first." It's gonna go back and forth, and it reads like wrestling, man. It reads like Hulk Hogan, and it's colorful. I don't really see that there's a whole lot of comparison. Sam throws a party, I am the party. Well, let's define get along. Do we have each other's phone numbers? No. Do we share strong drink and reasonable historic stories with each other? No. I guess my answer is no.
Sammy's complaint is that David isn't real. David is this guy that like you see on stage and he puts up this big front, and then backstage he's this totally different guy. So fucking what? Like, that's what makes him great. That actually is Dave, is the fact that he has this showmanship. He presents himself one way, and that's to add this entire flavor to the show, to do this big song and dance. What made Van Halen great in the original years was that popular music flair that he added to that the dance theme and chorus to some of the songs with that hard rock background to it. That balanced out pretty awesome. Now, to the point of Sammy's were these down home great rock and roll songs, the backyard. Sammy would probably be the guy that I would be friends with. He would be my bestest bud. Versus Dave. Dave is like the Wizard of Oz, where he's like, you pull out the curtain and, you kind of don't want to see that. But when you see the kind of the smoking head and all the crazy fun and the song and dance and the swords and the splits and everything, like, yeah, like, don't ruin the mystique for me. He's like a magician, he presents one thing and it's all like, sleight of hand and, don't look this way, look that way. And, I do love the little limericks. And if you ever see Dave in an interview, he could have been a comedian in a different life. He really says some of the most ridiculously funny things. I've always loved his take on love. He's like, oh, money can't buy you love, but you sure can pull your yacht right up next to it and go on over and see how the party's going. And that's the type of shit that I love about David Lee Roth. Sammy doesn't have that, but Sammy is the guy that I probably would hang out with all the time. He's just such a down-home, great dude. I really, I just wanted to put kind of to rest the argument between which is better. I mean, they're two totally different things. And then our final number one album, I was surprised because I don't think this was ever really one of my favorites ever. But now that I've broken it down and looked at how many fives it has, Van Halen 2 is just such an underrated album and such a great sophomore album for the band. There's a lot of pop sounding songs. There's a lot of great dance songs here. This album has 9 fives. And that's all of the songs on here gets a 5 except one. And that's You're No Good, which is a cover song. You're No Good gets a 4, which means I still love it. So for whatever reason, this is the album that has all of just such perfect songs. And if you want to argue Light Up the Sky and Out of Love and all those, is like, no. Yeah, those songs come on, and I'm like, these are 5s. These are 5 songs. Go back, listen to this album again, and you'll be pressed to try to argue that some of these aren't some of the greatest Van Halen songs. But across the board, this is such a great album.
For some of you may not have been surprised that Van Halen 2 was the best album, but when you break it down, it really is. It's song after song after song is a high caliber song. 5 stars almost across the board. So I should have known. I should have known. I want to thank you again for watching. I'm Foxy Cellars. If you would, go ahead, click like, help me out, subscribe to my videos, and you'll get keyed into future ones just like this. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks.